We are so pleased to be working with Joanne over the last, actually about a year on this particular project, and she's just really been not only patient and filled with just some of the most intriguing ideas and bringing such incredible artistry into our conversations and into our lives here at St. Catharine, that we're really pleased to have her here for what is actually the second installment of a series of presentations, talks, that sort of thing, affiliated with These Thy Gifts, textile art inspired by Wendell Berry. The first was an opening reception at which we had well over 100 people. It's actually probably a little bit closer to 130, 140 people or so who were gracious enough to come out and hear Joanne give a little, kind of a teaser about the work that will be more fully expounded upon in this afternoon's gallery talk. And the last installment in that series of presentations will be in Miss Betty Brookfield's, one of her classes. Betty is the chair of our fine arts department here at St. Catharine College, and all of this would not have come together without her, as well as without the wonderful work of our Fine Arts Committee. I see that Chris O'Daniel is here in the Fine Arts Committee, and Teresa Tedder. Any other fine arts? Their representation is right here at this, the Nexus is over at that table. So today, so Joanne is going to tell us a little bit about her inspirations, her techniques, and in the fiber art series that we will then move from this room after
When I'm finished.
After a while.
Maybe 2 minutes and maybe 20.
When the spirit moves, we will go down to the second floor where the art installation of 6 panels is on display in the mezzanine of this new beautiful space, the Emly W. Hundley Library. This has already made at least one round, but if you wouldn't mind signing into our guest book, we'd really love to know who has come out on such a lovely afternoon to hear Joanne talk about her work. And Joanne, I'll just go ahead and pass that around. One of the, I suspect that many of you are already quite familiar with Joanne and her work and know a bit about her background, but for those of you for whom Joanne is a new figure and a new artist, I'll just give you the snippet overview. Joanne was the head of Human Services for Louisville, Jefferson County, and when she retired, she found a fruition in new life as a fiber artist. She earned a Master of Fine Arts in textile art from the University of Louisville, and she has since served as the president of the Louisville Area Textile Association. I know that I did not quite get that name right, but this is a real honor for us at St. Catharine to have her here, because she has really encapsulated in her work from working as a, I kind of think of you as the head social worker for Louisville, in which food justice issues have really figured largely into the work that she did there, and to see the ways that she's kind of merged her artistry with her investment in the community in this particular project is really fascinating to us, and we're really honored to have her share that with us. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joanne.
Thank you so much for coming out on what really is a beautiful day. We've been down here for a couple of hours enjoying the campus and enjoying meeting a lot of the sisters who are not able to join us this afternoon because of a major event that they have over at the Mother House. But this is wonderful. I told everybody I'll be ready for 2 or 200, whatever it is that shows up. So I appreciate the interest. I really do. Let me just spend a little bit of time giving you an overview of what I hope to accomplish this afternoon, what brought me to this point today. And then after a little bit of a presentation here, we'll walk downstairs. What I really am geared toward doing with you today is showing you how my art evolved, talking a little bit more about process, how I discovered ideas, how I discovered concepts, how I got from my starting point of actually having the courage to call myself an artist rather than somebody who did art, or whatever it is that we called ourselves before we could really say, I am an artist. And how it is that I got involved with actually doing the presentation of pieces here at St. Catharine. Let me point out how that actually happened. I tend to work in a series when I'm working. I'll complete 4, 5, 6 pieces that tend to have a theme. And when that's over, I kind of have to catch up with life, clean my studio, and maybe do a couple of other kinds of things before I begin. I almost get hungry for starting the next series. So I had finished, it was a show at Spalding, and that was focused on Floyd's Fork. Then took that little bit of a respite, and I was about ready to start something again. And as I talk, I'll link you back to the connection with Wendell Berry. I noticed in the Record newspaper that comes to our home that St. Catharine was opening a program on sustainable agriculture that was based on the teachings, writings, and principles of Wendell Berry. That appealed to me. It was like, oh my, it's got to be my next series. I knew nothing about it. It was the first I read, and Leah Baines was a name that was sort of mentioned in the article as being the director, the newly named director of this program. So I emailed Leah, would you entertain my doing a series of art pieces? And you got back to me very quickly. And it was only after the fact I discovered there was no gallery, but we were building a library. So we'll talk to the librarian. So she and Betty from the art department were just very supportive. I came down and I met some of your faculty and some of your other staff at that small meeting we had back in the spring. And it was like, okay, let's go for it. And Alona Burdett, who's the head librarian here, was very welcoming. So this is one of how long has this building been open?
Since April, I think, officially.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a new building, and this is a new activity, and it's a great building to link the college to the community. So with that, what I'm going to do, and this is new technology, this is magic. I can touch this and it moves. So let me just take you through this PowerPoint that I've prepared. And I also have some items over here that will give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about. There, okay. I just got to press hard. I'm going to learn how to press it. I have worked in textiles probably off and on for a number of years, but being a working mom, a volunteer, working full-time outside of the home, just trying to balance all of those things. The main thing that I did to keep my finger in the art world was to do banners at Epiphany, the parish that we belonged to at the time. I'm pointing to Sister Josette because you were there for some of the time when I was doing banners. So I had that sense of textile, of working with textiles as I moved along. But I didn't necessarily see myself as a textile artist. Probably the very first time that I ever showed publicly was by invitation. And this was back in I think 96 or 97. I don't know the exact date. But some of you may have known Jim Hayden, the watercolorist in Louisville. He was very active with the Louisville Watercolor Society. He invited me, it was by invitation only, but I was invited to participate in a special show. And it was at, I forget what we even called it then, but it was a gallery that was associated with the cathedral downtown Louisville, right there at 5th and Muhammad Ali. And the show, to have a piece in the show, they were renovating the pre-Civil War bell tower at the cathedral. And you had to incorporate copper, marble, and or wood from the old bell tower. So I did that, and I've still got some scraps. This is copper from that old bell tower. It's just burnt, just the tarnish and the patina after 100+ years. And this is an old piece of marble that came off. But the reason I'm showing this, and I'll just put these things over here. I'm not going to pass a lot of stuff around because then you get distracted. The reason I'm showing this piece is when I was putting this PowerPoint together, I realized this piece actually established my way of working. It didn't establish it, but I discovered in retrospect, the way I started working with this piece is exactly the way that I continue to work. There was some parameters. You have to use materials from the Cathedral Bell Tower. Cathedral of the Assumption. Okay, I went and I started digging into the Feast of the Assumption. And one of the things that I learned in that research is that in Eastern European culture, the Feast of the Assumption is significant. It's almost their harvest festival. But the Feast of the Assumption is August 15th, even in Eastern European calendars. And they have processions to Mary, the Virgin. But a lot of it is icon, because you're again in the Orthodox and in the Eastern cultures. And they strew herbs on the road, on the street, as they walk, as they process through the villages, honoring Our Lady of the Herbs. And this was all new information to me, but I just loved that process of learning about something that was going to be the focus of a piece of art. I've continued that process of researching that way, not so much to learn about it, but to give myself a range of authentic visual images that I can pull from when I get ready to create a piece. The second aspect of this piece that I realize I still hold to as much as possible. I grew up in a small church in Providence, well, not small, but it was a parish in Providence, Rhode Island. Assumption, the Assumption of Blessed Virgin Mary. It's more than 100 years old, and it was basically established in what, as I grew up, was, basically inner city Providence, the south end of South Providence. It was established as an Irish immigrant parish post-famine, as the Irish was settling into southern New England. And I knew the pastor there, Father Trainer. So we went and we visited Dan Trainer, because I basically said, is there anything from that parish that I could use as materials in the piece that I'm about the Assumption? So this, don't touch this. Okay, so all of this in here is an old stole that the priest wore back in the day from the Assumption Parish. The fringes and all of this cut blue here. This is the copper. This cross. This is based on the iconic images of the kind of holding of the child. Down here is the textile embroidery. It's all the herbs. And I actually looked. If you really could get in there, you'd see thyme and all the standard herbs. This was dyed silk, and the first time I ever did anything to show in public. But that was, I realized that is kind of the way I work. The next thing that happened for me, and try to touch it here. Within a few months, because again, I was doing this sort of on the side, but beginning to have the courage to show publicly. Somebody at work said, would you be willing to create a piece for the Shamrock Foundation auction? And I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. So what I did there, this was the second piece I did, and I submitted it to the auction. Interestingly enough, the person who bought it at the auction gave it to somebody else who ended up living next door to my sister-in-law. So I actually, 10 years later, was able to visit this piece in somebody's home. I couldn't believe it. But again, here, this was just the Song of the Humpback Whale is what I called it. But this also, I did the same kind of thing, the same kind of research, just to learn a little bit about humpbacks, and then created this piece and began to address some of the environmental issues or concerns that have stayed thematic as I've gone through making work. So now we're still in the late 90s, okay? A couple of things began happening. I began, as things would be important to me or something would impress me, now I'm beginning to think maybe I can use art to look a little bit more into that particular thing or process or aspect or whatever you want to call it. Around this time, I had to go to Atlantic City to do a presentation related to my job. And I was invited to have dinner at somebody's home. This is up in New Jersey, and I never spent a lot of time in New Jersey. I mean, like, who would go to New Jersey, right? But this family lived in the Pine Barrens. And I grew up by the ocean, and they were in a house that was dated to George Washington's time, right on the edge of the water where a small river came into a cove to the Atlantic. And it's like, how did this house not get washed away by hurricanes? So I became fascinated and again researched what is it about the Pine Barrens, and I learned that it's basically depth filled with sand. So that all that grows there, these pines, blueberries, and now they do cranberries there also, because this is natural to that area. And carnivorous, these plants are carnivorous because they eat bugs. So, I mean, it's just a phenomenal landscape. And that fascinated me. So this became blueberry season in the Pine Barrens. Another thing, right about this time, I was doing some genealogy. And my dad's family had moved to Iowa through the Chicago area to work the railroads. And I realized that I began looking at doing something that would be related to that because they grew up in what was the plain, the prairie. So again, taking the time to research, I found out there was a tall grass prairie, a short grass prairie, just lots of, we even have some virgin prairie in Kentucky that has been untouched. It's just a couple of acres down between Hopkinsville and Paducah. I haven't gotten there personally, but I discovered things like that. So this is the tall grass prairies. That's where my father's family basically settled. So just, again, now what you can see about technique here is I'm doing a lot of machine embroidery. I'm doing a lot of three-dimensional things. These are all hand-dyed. I've always done hand-dyeing. I've always started with white fabric and dyed the fabric. And I fell into that by accident. Wanting to do a project, I went to Bayer's and they said, well, yeah, we got this dye and we got the silk. The silk was on sale, so I got a bolt, right? So I had to get the dye to go along with it. And that's how I discovered Dharma. Those of you that work in textiles know the Dharma company out in California. So I started getting, just using dyes and teaching. This is all self-taught. So what now I'm beginning, Ed and I, my husband is there in the back, and he's been a lot of the support that has allowed me to kind of do all of this also. We enjoy traveling, and I discovered that using my art was a wonderful way for me to record the pleasure of our travels. My dad's family originated up in County Down in the Mourne Mountains. I went out one Sunday there when we were up in the Mournes and took a picture of these sheep. And these are in front of some fields where my family actually apparently did some farming because the lodge manager basically pointed out where the ground was wavy, where during the famine, it was basically a graveyard for some of the family, my family. So I took the photograph. Here, this is a technique I'm beginning to use. Take the photograph, run it on silk, and then embroider the silk into the background. So, again, I'm using, there's the Mourne Mountains. Australia. Ed has cousins down in Brisbane. And one of the most fascinating things we saw up around Wendell was a sugar cane. We were up there at sugar cane burning time, which is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And that's where I found out about cane breaks, where they have the breaks because they burn the sugar cane to harvest the sugar. So this was our trip to Australia. We went to Alaska. Sockeye salmon. I just, again, researched and found out the color, the size, how they swam, and all of that. So and again, let me point out, most of these pieces are going to be, about this wide, this high, because I tend to take the selvage, selvage to selvage. So if I got 60-inch fabric, however long it's going to be, I chop it off and then I cut it down the middle. That's just about the size that I go towards, and sometimes I make a quarter of that. So that's pretty much the size of most of these. So most of what I've shown you so far, I no longer have in my possession. You know, they have, I love it when somebody is interested enough to purchase it to put it on their wall. You know, that makes me happy. Not so much, it's not a financial benefit, it's just that people, it just really tickles me. Doing all this travel stuff, I also decided I better do something on Kentucky. So this was a series I did on Kentucky barns, one of the series. And again, you're seeing the intense machine embroidery, some applique, and again, this was a series of 3 that, just because if I'm doing all this on traveling, I might as well look a little bit at Kentucky. And so now we're into the early 2000s. I'm beginning to think, I'm enjoying what I'm doing, but there was part of me, and the only thing I could tell people that I knew what I was sort of talking about, is I wish I could figure out how to get more abstract. You know, how to not just do landscapes or objects, or how do I begin to incorporate concept into my art. And one of the people whom I had discovered early on was a woman by the name of Jane Dunwall. Some of you may know Jane, and this was her earliest book, Complex Cloth, and I absolutely fell in love with her approach, her techniques, her style, her work. And I discovered that she did a work, this is her most recent book, and it's basically a 15-year later, 20-year later update of what's in this book. She's originally from Columbus, Ohio, down in San Antonio now, but I discovered that she did a workshop, one week workshop on finding your voice. So we went to San Antonio. Ed was gracious enough to kind of find stuff to do around San Antonio during the day when I was over in Jane's studio. But, we've stayed in touch, and she's now comes to Louisville even and does some, work with textile artists here in town. And she remembers me from this time back in 2004, where she just said, pick an image for this week that we will just explore. And for lack of knowing what else I wanted to do, I chose the seed, looking at a seed. This was the work wall, and I think the picture is in, should actually be rotated. This is one of the work walls I happened to take a picture of, so I was looking for things to put in this PowerPoint. This was one of the earliest things as I was beginning to find a voice. This is where I went. This was one of the pieces that I, just playing with textile, beginning to look at what happens with seed, images that for me, reminiscent or I can associate with growth. And then one of the first series that I did when I finished this, it was a 3-piece series. And here I'm actually using a couple of screens that I made when I was down in San Antonio discovering my voice. That circle there, some of these lines in the background, this grid down here. Just, they don't look like seed. I mean, they don't necessarily associate with seed. But for me, they began being a good background. These are the first screens that I actually made myself. I just went out to Preston's and got some silk screens, and I used house paint, to block out where I wanted the image to be. So I made 3 screens, and I used those 3 seeds in a series of 3 pieces. But this was probably the first piece that I did. After that, Finding Your Voice workshop down in San Antonio. And what I'm also beginning to do here was the background is complex and abstract, but then the stitching becomes a part of the texture, becomes a part of the story that I'm trying to tell. And this pretty much has continued to be the way that I work. Creating a complex background as a ground for stitch. I began teaching myself, or I actually began this is when I got serious at U of L. Registered, I'd been taking classes and I was able to count, I think, one of them towards getting my master's degree. And I hadn't retired, I was still working at this time, but I was able to fit it into my work schedule. And I took a screen class, how to silk screen. I took that class from Joanne Weis at U of L. And it was really neat. Suddenly I discovered there's really a machine that you can use, but I only had access to it for one semester. And these are the kinds of things that you start doing. This was just ink on wax paper that became the screen that I used for those waves. So what that actually is that's on organza that kind of floats loose. So you can see the color behind it. And I've got a little bit of stitching in there that you can't really see. But now I'm also beginning to look at subject matter. I think I've mentioned I come from Rhode Island, and I was discovering some of the good things that were beginning to happen in the environment. And there's one cove that's not too far from where we live. And I started really, they won an award. I read that before we went to Rhode Island that summer, and I made it a point. We went over to that particular cove, the Ninegret Park, because what had happened was years ago when they were doing something to make room for boats, they had put in some kind of an artificial barrier that had basically created silt, that had eliminated the eelgrass, that had eliminated the fish that live in the eelgrass. And both the University of Rhode Island and a number of federal agencies basically got in there and restored the eelgrass. So this is just, that kind of a piece, just beginning to look at the celebration of some of the good things that are happening in the environment. Some osprey, I did a piece at this time on osprey nests because we were beginning to find safe places for the osprey to nest in that same area. And again, the stitching, the background, and the subject matter is beginning to gel around the environment. And maybe some of the good things are happening in the environment. Now, technique-wise, I also am beginning to sense I want to get a little bit more control or manage a little bit better those backgrounds. Everything I've been doing up to this point, I just throw stuff in the dye bath, and whatever comes out, that becomes my challenge for the composition of the piece. But I also was beginning to want a little bit more organization to the background. So I began teaching myself, again, a very environmentally friendly material that's water soluble. It was invented, basically they developed it up in Indiana when they were making soy candles, because soy was a product, so just really a good thing to use with soy wax. And what I started doing was painting backgrounds with soy wax, and then painting and dyeing over that. Now these are small pieces, because a lot of times when I'm doing a study, I'll work small. This became a series of 4 that looked at the Wilderness Act of 1964. And I am now beginning to put text into the pieces, but I don't want to have it be text like a brochure or a pamphlet or teaching, but text as suggestive of what's really going on. So I took pieces of the Wilderness Act and I broke it up so that when you're reading it, you realize that what happened in 1964 was really nice. But we haven't quite done it the way it was intended. So here the text is actually broken up a bit. But in the Wilderness Act, they talk about protecting the forest. So you can see where I've used stitch and color and what happened with the soy wax to create the image of forest, mountain, desert. And here, again, some of the research, these are actually screens that I made using pictures of old fossils that are found in the desert. Those colors I had to try to be suggestive of desert and sea. And again, this is the same screen that I used in the piece with the chiffon. So I'm discovering that there's some favorite screens and themes that I can use as I'm going along. So now I really like what's beginning to happen, and I'm beginning to use soy wax now to organize my background. So this is part of a series that I called Hymn from Pine Mountain. And Ed and I went down and spent a couple of days in the Pine Mountain State Park and just kind of went around. But again, the other thing that I'm trying to do is look at some of the environmental concerns. So here, I'm laying out the soy wax and putting in some of the color. Because this, one of the things I discovered is EKU and a couple of the coal companies, basically in restoration of some of the area that they've reclaimed because of the coal mining. In one area, we're getting a lot of real, and I think it's still going on, reintroducing the honeybee to one of the mountain peaks there in the Pine Mountain area. The other thing that I did was this is another thing that has become important to me, is look for authentic materials. In this particular series, I used hymns that were common to the churches in eastern Kentucky, in the Appalachian region. And I actually got with a friend of mine who plays the mountain dulcimer and got dulcimer sheet music. So those became the screens that I used in that particular series. So by the time I'm finished, here you've got, this was the final piece of this one that was a series. It was just, again, it's about this big. With the screening, the stitching, the introduction of text, putting it all together. Again, that's a detail of the same thing. And that is, again, the evolution, the next step in what it is that I'm doing with my work. Customized floating tools?
Done.
Done. I'm done with you. Done. Now something else, this is another, I talked to Lee about this a couple of times. Also, I'm not doing these things in isolation. I've got other stuff other pieces I'm making maybe at the same time. This is just kind of, I picked the ones that I think give you a sense of progress that leads to what's downstairs. I began getting fixated with food. I'm not a foodie, but I began to realize how significant food is to cultures and to people. And one of the other things that I do also is I'll look for, I came across this book, Sacred Food. So I just kind of keep it as a reference. I've never done anything based on it, but just to know that people actually use food as a vehicle for sacred practice. So that's, in addition to the kind of research that I do. I discovered corn. We were in Guatemala, and the mythology, the creation mythology in Guatemala, basically is based on corn. So this is, the Mayan creation story. But again, I work in series, so I had to do another one on corn. And this is just the green corn ceremony that's that's pretty common within our Native American culture. Okay, now the other thing that I began doing right about this time, and you'll see some of it in the work downstairs. I'm picking these out again because when we go downstairs, I'll show you where they play into what's down there. I began using photographs. Now this is a photograph of some old marble. We were in Turkey, and this is at Ephesus. This is just an old piece of Turkish marble just hanging around there. And I've started collecting these images that then become things like waves in another series. A group of us did a show at the Water Tower, and some of my friends that shared that show are here with me today, on the Ohio River. And the alchemist symbol for water is that inverted triangle. The wave, and a couple of other things. So this one became, go the other way, this piece. So you can see the wave, you can see the grid, you can see the stitching, and this is one of the screens that I like using. I've got a couple of things here that I'll just pass around. This fish. This is on raw silk, screened in, And I just like the image, so I've used that in a number of pieces. This isn't the one that you guys have, Rose, Patricia, and John.
No,
You
that's
get one
not
of
that
this
one.
series.
It's one in that series.
Yeah, it's
but
one in the
not that.
series. But this was also the time, one of the things happened with my research. I researched the Ohio River, and I found some amazing facts. The Ohio River is 981 miles long. I actually put this stuff together. It flows through and borders on 6 states. Waters from 5 other states flow into it. The Ohio River, several treaties named the Ohio River as the border between settlers and the native people way back when. We were doing it. I discovered all these facts in researching the Ohio River. And I was so fascinated. This isn't the one that ended up in the show. I decided to do a handmade book that incorporated all of the facts from about the Ohio River that I had learned. But they were so disparate. They were negative. It needed something to pull them together. And now, where is that? Well, it's here somewhere. I got so organized. Oh, here it is. It dropped off the back. Okay. One of the things that I did with this was it needed something to pull it together. And right about that time, I'm not sure how, I came across Wendell Berry's Sabbath poem, series of Sabbath poems. And there was one of the poems that he wrote, "Sit and be still until in the time of no rain you hear beneath the dry wind's commotion in the trees, the sound of flowing water among the rocks, a stream unheard before, and you are where breathing is prayer." That said everything that I could think of about the river. So I wrote to Mr. Berry to get permission to use that poem in the book that I was putting together to go in the show at the Water Tower. So I did get his permission back to use that poem. But I also, at that point, realized that a lot of what he was doing with words is what I was trying to do with my textiles. So I just began reading a little bit more of Wendell Berry's work, which led to the aha moment when I was looking for something to do. Another thing in the travels, I'm going to walk you through this. This was a photograph that we took when we were in Japan. And I'll get it down by the time we're finished. I'll make screens from the photographs. So you can see here, in addition to doing the soy wax stuff, I actually laid this particular temple screen down that I did from one of my own photographs, made a screen, laid it down, and again, this is one of my food series, the Japanese tea ceremony. So again, you can see in the background, you can see in there, this is, the temples that I showed you a minute ago. But they become hidden, it's just layer upon layer upon layer, again, starting with white fabric. And the screen is one that I drew myself. But this basically was, again, part of that foodie thing, where we went to Australia and I did a piece on the bunya ceremony, the Aboriginals, with the pine nuts. And Eucharist is even, text became something important to me. I started a series when we went out west on the goals of the Bureau of Land Management to basically, protect, take large spaces and protect, basically, one is natural fire, indigenous animals, indigenous plants, etc. And one of the sixth goal is to preserve the wilderness for people to find solitude and respite. And basically, meditation also, prayer and meditation was part of some of what was in the literature that they had. And I wanted to do a series on the goals of the Bureau of Land Management, but how do you do meditation? How do you do prayer? How do you show that? So what I actually did, I don't know if you can see this, and this is when we took the workshop from Lori Doctor. all of that writing, just tore it all up and incorporated it into each of the pieces of that series. So this is the Bureau of Land Management goal to protect fire, for natural fire. And here I actually, you see where I cut up the be still, go away. Here I actually ripped up, if I had detail, just ripped the fabric down the middle and stitched it on top of black to get the idea. Photograph of cracked clay at Yellowstone. This was part of the series Floyd's Fork. A friend of ours goes out and counts bugs. They set a day around the state to go out and if there are certain bugs that are there that are missing, they can't tolerate the pollution. So you look for these certain bugs, which means that the water is clean. So our friend monitors for Shears Creek, and he gave me the brochure. This is one of the bugs. But again, I think you can see back here where I just did the screen from Yellowstone, because that made sense that that would be part of that piece that looked at bugs in clean water. This is one of the last last couple of pieces I did, looking at Appalachia and water in Appalachia. And again, songs, that need that interest in being authentic. I went to Berea, to their music archives, and actually found copies of old mountain music that I made into a screen. And here again, I selected this because you can see, again, I really like that fish screen. I just use those fish a lot. Appalachia, mountaintop removal is a heartbreak. And I got permission from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth to use this photo. And then I actually copied the photo, you can see that, this is on paper, and then put it onto this piece that recognizes just the devastation of mountaintop removal. But again, trying to communicate the layers through the eons that have created the coal that's part of our Eastern Kentucky culture. Now, the other thing too, just while I mentioned earlier that a lot of times I'll do smaller pieces when I'm actually doing studies. And this is the kind of thing that I might just play with, just do the dyeing and the stamping and the stitching. Just go ahead and pass that around. And I'll start some over here. Again, this is the kind of thing, like I will just put this in the water, in the dye, and I'll get these random shapes, and I'll decide to use that for something, but then I'll put this up on my wall, and I'll try to figure out, okay, how am I gonna, what composition will fit in this? And this is kind of, the other thing too, I think you can see from some of what I've done, is grit. I like a grit, and I think this is bamboo fabric. One of the smaller studies that I did, I'll start this over here, sometimes I'll actually take the time to put it together. If it's small and I'm going to present it, I've tended to go towards this kind of stretch on wood because it just gives it a presence. But this is here I was testing monoprint, which is a process where you put ink on something and then you put it down on the fabric, so you can just kind of look around, pass that around. But again, these are pieces that just kind of are part of what has evolved as I've gone through. I'll test techniques. Here I'm just trying all sorts of ways of showing water, just as I'm looking at water. So you can just pass it. That's a piece of silk. The other thing I started doing recently, and I've got a couple pieces here, is I will go someplace and I'll sketch. Now this was up at Point Judith, which is up in Rhode Island, and this was periwinkles on rocks at low tide. So that's the sketch. I then try to do that on paper, not doing a landscape, but trying to get color and texture that goes along with the sketch. And here's another one that, yeah, this is, I saw a woman collecting periwinkles at low tide. So just because some of the Southeast Asian families up in the Northeast, periwinkles are a delicacy, so they go out at low tide and get the periwinkles. For the series downstairs, I spent a day out at Bob's farm. So there are a couple of sketches like this, where I did the sketching and then did the interpretation and stitch. The other thing that's very important as I go through is what is the fabric that I use. You know, that also has to have an authenticity. And what is the color that you use? So I'm not going to pass these around. These are just some samples of hemp that I practiced all these different dyes with just to get a sense of what would happen. Because as I started the series down for Wendell Berry, it dawned on me, I have to use hemp. I just have to use hemp. And then finding hemp that was a fine weave that would take my screens, that was a challenge. So we need to be growing hemp in Kentucky. But this is a small, this is one of this size, you know, and here I'm just playing with, I was learning a new technique, so when I teach myself a new technique, I might actually finish one up that's small, just to get a sense of what it is. That one is the one that's going around. I've also experimented with three-dimensional kinds of things. This I call burden bag, and I don't know if you can recognize it, but in our Native American cultures, a lot of people, there's some cultural practice where they put a bag outside of the teepee or the tent or the lodge, where guests coming in put their burdens into that bag so they don't carry the burdens into the house. So I just, you know, this is a three-dimensional thing. A hobo series, I did a small series and again, this is the one on food, but hobos that were, you know, riding the rails, they just fascinated me. And my dad did that for a few years after the Depression. So I had some personal, but again, I went back and I got want ads from Depression area Courier Journal as the text that's there. And I did a whole series, and they were just 12 by 12 on symbols that the hobos put up. There's the fish. Part of where I developed this was I had a health scare a few years ago. And I actually began researching amulets, different things that different cultures used as protections. So I did a whole series that was just based on amulets that were protective. And then sometimes I do something that's absolutely just in me. I felt that I really wanted to say a statement in this piece, and there are a couple of others that are sort of like this, on the Underground Railroad. But it was almost like I wasn't sure I had the permission to do that. I actually talked to a close friend of mine who's African American. Can I do a piece that talks about the pain of the Underground Railroad? And then the Interfaith passed a piece. I don't know if any of you know Terry Taylor and that organization. He actually organized like a 3-day walk around Louisville, just looking at places that were pertinent to the Underground Railroad, starting at the Quaker Meeting House, going through Farmington, ending up over New Albany at the church where they would actually go across the river. We went down into all that backwash in Portland. I mean, we walked all of that. And so as I got ready to do this piece, the walking was very much a part of, but I did that because I really needed, that was the research I did there. Because this was actually an ad that was in our newspaper in Louisville. And this is a logo that was all over the city at that time, looking for runaway slaves. And that's, again, the kind of research and the kind of topic that I might get interested in. This is a series I did on the Psalms, a couple of years ago, and again, food plays into it. Here's just a couple of the sketches, the way I do sketching. This again is from Point Judith, the rose hip. Some leaves out in Floyd's Fork. Bob's Farm, a photo, what the sketch became. And then for one of the pieces downstairs, I went to one of the farmers markets and just took pictures of the signs. Local honey, I think a lot of people have seen this, but this one I had never seen, raw live sauerkraut. So, and I just closed this PowerPoint with one of the Wendell Berry poems that's downstairs. A couple of things I just kind of want to show you before we go down is, this is again a piece of the hemp. This is one that I immersed and just didn't like. But you can, this is how a piece might start, you know, like the little one that's going around. And then I'll play with images. The leaves in the piece downstairs, I actually went out and got leaves in the yard and put paint on them and tried that on fabric, so that's what's downstairs. I played with making an egg. There's a piece downstairs that has an egg on it. You know, just practicing on this kind of thing. I practiced on some of these. I made a screen, but then I went back in and did the coloring by hand because the screen wasn't coming across intense enough. The corn, you'll see the corn downstairs. You know, just again, these are silk screens that I make. The other thing that happens is the color becomes important. And all of this is all the hemp, and I just kept experimenting until I found dyes and over dyes that were close to what I wanted to use in the pieces downstairs. And I think this is one of the ones that's down there, and this is one color over soy wax, then re-dyed in another color. But again, looking for those natural kinds of, and this is just one color over soy wax. I'll leave this stuff here if anybody wants to come look at it. And then just as a last thing, because people will always ask, how do I make the screens that I use? Thermofax, all I need is a carbon image. So, and the recipes downstairs, I collected copies of recipes from friends that were family recipes. This is my mother's handwriting on our family Irish bread recipe. This is the screen. This is a Thermofax screen I made, based, you know, just using this carbon-based image. Make the screen. So you'll see her recipe downstairs on the piece. And then even things like, this is, you know, all I need is a Xerox copy to make that screen. And tablecloth is checkered, so that's, you know, the kind of a screen I'd use there. The other way that I'll develop something is I'll draw, like you'll see the chickens. I just drew this, and I just did it a bunch of times so it became this, and even more times so it became this. And that's the screen that I use downstairs on the chicken piece. So I think what I've hoped I've done here with the PowerPoint, before we go downstairs, I didn't talk a lot about technique. When I meet with your class, Betty, I'll spend a little bit more time talking technique, because I think the students are interested in that a little bit more than process. But just the evolution not only of the art creation process, but the thought process and even the soul that goes into some of the work. So maybe at this point, are there any questions that you think we need to answer up here? Because we'll go downstairs now and just look at those pieces downstairs. And I'll kind of quickly bring you back to some of what we talked about up here. So you'll, and I'll be around for as long as need be if there are any questions or any handling or whatever. Betty?
I just want to make one comment, and as we say in Kentucky, I'm fixing to give you a compliment. I appreciate how you have articulated that artists are thinkers. There's a lot of planning, a lot of research, a lot of love already given to the piece before you actually get to what the finished piece is, which is constantly in flux or in another motion to be appearing later in another piece of work. But you have really shown in just our time together today how much goes into that. I think many people think artists just have this natural gift and they just create a piece of work, but it's from many, many sources. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
A question too, when you were talking about finding your voice and you began your remarks about, I am an artist. Was there a pivotal moment in your mind that put you in that category?
There are two parts of that, and the question was there a pivotal moment when I could say I'm an artist? Some of you in here are familiar with The Artist's Way. Carol, I can't remember her name right now. And I didn't really do that as a rigid ritual, but a lot of the morning papers and all that kind of stuff, I couldn't quite get into that. But there was one exercise that she suggested, and it's just keep writing. I am an artist. My name is such a, what I wrote is, I, Joanne, am an artist who is prolific and successful, and just wrote that for three straight pages. I think that's what it was. And somewhere and that was an exercise that she recommended. Somewhere in the process of that, I really began feeling like an artist. And it was an actual, it was almost a jolt. And I just kept writing that over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And that was slightly pivotal. I mean, that wasn't the deal breaker, or the deal maker, but that began to give me permission to even look forward to say I am an artist. And I think that would have been shortly before I went to San Antonio. It was part of that. And then also the room that is my studio. We've got 2 kids, and you know how kids are. They move out, they move back, they move out, they move back, they move out. Well, I took over my son's bedroom. You can't move back. And it took me a while to not say my son's bedroom, or what used to be my son's bedroom, to get to the point where I could say it's my studio. So those 2 things kind of happened and I discovered that there was something there that made it okay for me to recognize that I was an artist. And that was well before I thought about getting a master's degree in art or any of that. It just, because, in terms of the master's degree in art, I had been taking classes with Lyda Gordon in the fiber department when she started having them on Tuesday evenings, because I worked downtown, I could run to the university after work. The kids were now grown. They were gone, and Ed was good. He was wonderful on Tuesdays. He cooked for himself and cooked for me, and dinner would be ready when I came home, kind of thing. But it was never a technique class. It was always critique, where we just made stuff, and we then the class would critique each other. So I never really took class in technique at the university. But Lyda knew my work well enough so that when it was time to make application for the master's degree program, she was able to convince the admissions board that I was a serious artist. So even though I didn't have the undergraduate degree, I didn't have any of the credits that might have been required to get into the master's program, because she knew my work as head of that particular division within the department, I was able to get in. And that also began to reinforce maybe I am an artist. And that's when I took the one class with John Weitzel in silk screening. That's really the only formal technique class I've ever taken. Everything else has been pretty much self-taught or critique, just getting together with other good artists that I trust to say, that looks bad. Or did you ever think of doing this? Or what about that? So does that...
The basis of that question was it an intrinsic moment or an extrinsic moment? And it sounds like it's just a tiny bit of both.
Yeah.
You convinced yourself that you were an artist,
Yeah.
but you had an exterior
Yeah.
from your professor and from...
Yeah, and when I began saying I'm an artist, people didn't go, you're a what? So there was even some of that external reinforcement that it was good stuff that I was producing. But yeah, it's a good question. I came to when I was working with the different hemp fabrics, and tried to get this in where dirt might be part of the story. And this is just a very simple piece. This is about pollination and just returning to natural pollination that happens with bugs. These are bees' wings, and with flowers just dropping seeds. So you can just see the dropping of seeds. The Fibonacci, and there's another screen that I use a lot that you'll see in a lot of my work, is the Fibonacci circle. So I've just used the Fibonacci here in different places. And also in each of these, I selected some text, and I made one of those Thermofax screens from some text. And 3 of them I have a text that, and again, what I'm doing is I'm using Xerox copies. And part of the story there was I got my Thermofax machine at a Jefferson County Public School auction over on Crittenden Drive, because these things go back to the 40s, okay? And everything else went that day. The most expensive other thing was 20 bucks. Most everything was $5 down to $1, you know, and I'll throw in the table that all those computers are on for another buck. $400 because I was competing against a tattoo artist, because the tattoo artist also used these old Thermofaxes. So all I need is a carbon base, and I thought my Thermofax was breaking, and the bulb, the replacement bulb, mine is so old, is one maybe in the country that might be $700 out of Philadelphia. So it's like I'm really protecting this thing. And I thought it was going bad on me. It turns out Kinko's changed their formula, and there was no longer carbon in the ink that they were using. So I just went out and got my own $99 copier. And so I know there's carbon in my ink. But the text here and on two other pieces, my husband's father was part of that whole Maryland and Virginia to Kentucky crew that came in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And his great-great-grandfather wrote a journal between 1860 and 1864. He was a farmer in Spencer County. And parts of that journal, you know, talk about harvesting the peaches and planting the corn. And somewhere in here, they went up to Louisville to get a cider mill. And it took 3 days from where they were right there on Salt River to get to Louisville to get the cider mill to bring it back. So the text in this piece is from that journal. Abundance, again, here I just, in the text here I hand wrote, just because I wanted to connect with it. It's a poem that I had upstairs on the screen. It's one of Wendell Berry's poems on grace. And it just talks about the harvest. I just saw this as a time to talk about the harvest and the grace that goes along with the harvest. And again, you can see the screens. This is where I tested the doing. So there's some hand painting in here. And again, here the subtle stitchery. This is just, subtle stitchery in the sun. So not, the real dense stitchery you get on some of it. This is where I laid down the leaves I talked about upstairs, and you can still see some of the corn screens. This text is from the great-grandfather's journal. And the story here, that I was trying to communicate, when you get into Wendell Berry's writing, he talks a lot about family farm, and he defines family farm. It may not necessarily be run by a family, but it's the family basically knows what's there, and they do work the farm. And we've got some people here that do work their own farms, you and Bob and Sharon, and so you know what it is I'm talking about. One of the two people came up to me at the opening, and they were very moved by this piece. And one in particular is a gentleman I've known for quite a while, but I didn't know this part of his story. And he talked from Iowa, and he talked about moving his dad, when he was a young boy, they had to move from town out to the country. And I think it had to do with finances, I think it had to do with depression, and the dirt was exhausted. The dirt was absolutely exhausted. And they moved into a house that was ramshackled, that had no indoor plumbing, no electricity. It did have running water. And that basically they worked that dirt till it turned black. Mostly by just not planting the same thing over and over and over and over, but by rotating crop, by building crop. And he was almost in tears as he told me that about himself, because I didn't know that was part of his story. And again, this one is still the same text. And here, just family farm, just the variety of product. And again, what Jesse Kroom, that's the Spencer County farmer, was writing about getting stuff together. The other thing that you'll read about a lot in Wendell Berry's writing is factory, is the what's going on and the destruction with factory farms. And so the research and the reading I did here had a lot to do with what's going on up in the Delmarva Peninsula with the large chicken hatcheries, and just unbelievable. This is as close as I've ever gotten to doing anything that's like a political poster. That red X, I was a little bit uncomfortable with it, but it seemed to be the right thing to do. And then just the single egg that tries to counterpoint the healthy chicken environment with what's going on in some of the factory farms. This may actually be one of my favorites, because I think, Berry talks about, he actually, admits that I don't write a lot about food. I mean, he does say food is an agricultural act, but he doesn't write a lot about food. But in his most recent compilation, there's a whole section on the back that's just nothing but excerpts where he has written about food. But here I collected recipes from friends, and I made screens from those recipes, including my mother's Irish bread, it's right there, written in her own hand. On the index card, you can still see the lines. And that's one of the neat things about the Thermofax. All I need is a Xerox copy of this stuff to put it together. And then this is just what happens. The other thing that's quite prevalent in Berry's teaching is we have to support the farmers financially. That this has to be a sustainable income for them as farmers, as family, or that whole system will collapse. And the farmers market is one way that we can do that. CSA, there are lots of ways that we can do that. And Berry writes about that very specifically. Even you urbanites, there are ways that you can get in touch with the land. Know who's growing your food. Know where it's coming from. So I went to one of our farmers markets in Louisville and just took photos of the background here is just different photos, including the raw sauerkraut. Yeah, that's in there. The raw live sauerkraut. Yeah. That's over on Douglas. If anybody goes to Douglas, okay. He's still selling it, raw live sauerkraut. And just putting that down. And the other thing I put in here too, because a lot of our farmers markets do have music that goes along, so I just used one of those screens from that Appalachian music that I got at Berea to put in here. And again, I've accompanied the guide with a poetry and a prose quote from Berry on each of these pieces. That is, it isn't necessarily, those quotes didn't necessarily lead me to the piece, but in retrospect I went back and gleaned through his writings to identify something that did represent, but all of this work basically rolled out of my sense of what I was reading in Wendell Berry. And again, that kind of, it was just a wonderful happenstance where I was needing something to do. Berry, I was doing some reading on him, and then, this sustainable agriculture program. Hey, Leo, whoever you are, can we talk? So, and that's where this went. That's how this happened. So, are there any questions on
Yeah,
this?
I've got one.
Yes,
I
sir?
know you put a felt backing on it. Did you put a piece of grapefruit material in the middle, or is it just the hemp and the felt?
It's just the hemp, well, it's bonded. It's the hemp and the felt,
Okay.
and then the metal on the bottom
Okay,
with the Velcro.
okay.
Yeah. And I also have to commend the library. I was being a little bit facetious upstairs, but Alona Burdett is the head librarian here. And I think when Betty and Leah first approached her, this building was not done. And this building was, was in the process of being constructed. And to envision this as being a potential wall, and it's ideal. It is absolutely ideal.